Welcome to Marketing Speak, a series of interviews and monologues featuring thought leaders and industry practitioners in search engine optimization, e-commerce, and online marketing. Here's your host, Stefan Spencer, SEO expert, author, speaker, consultant, and internet entrepreneur.
Welcome to episode number 297. The show notes, including the transcript and checklist of this episode, are at marketingspeak.com/297. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "A mind once stretched by a new idea never regains its original dimensions." Unfortunately, though, in today's culture, we haven't been taught to think. We have pathways into thinking, but they don't feel robust enough. My guest on today's episode, Matt Church, decided to work toward changing all that. As the founder of Thought Leaders and a highly respected conference presenter, he communicates, connects, and challenges audiences and himself to be the best version of themselves. In today's show, we talk about the wisdom of ancient cultures and what we can now understand from them if we look at their experience through a different lens. We get into depth on the pink sheet, which has been a breakthrough methodology for me and for thousands of other people who have used this tool. By thinking full spectrum, what you do is you break your personal bias and you begin to become more considerate and compassionate to the diversity of the audience you're trying to reach. Your mind is going to stretch and achieve new dimensions today, I promise. And so without any further ado, on with an incredibly insightful and valuable show. Matt, it's so great to have you on the show.
I feel like you've just read the introduction my mother wrote. So thank you, Stefan. That's amazing. Yeah, I'm based in Sydney, Australia here. So hello to everybody. And wherever you are in the world and whenever you're listening to this, I hope all your loved ones are well and that you're healthy and that your world has some traction to it. It's getting some wheels and some motion, I hope.
Yeah. Now, there's something in your bio that really spoke to me. And I got to bring that out just before we dive into pink sheets and all the different cool modalities and systems and things that you've developed over the years. Highly intuitive. What does that mean for you? How are you accessing intuition?
That profile you just read was written by Jenny, who was my editor-in-chief for my most recent book called Rise Up, which is a book called An Evolution in Leadership. And so Jenny knows a lot about my ontological and metaphysical bents. And as a result of that, she wanted to weave some of that in. So it's always funny, like you were talking to me about knowledge panels, just before we got started and talking about expertise. I'm very aware that we all exist like diamonds and there are facets or windows into us, your LinkedIn profile, your Facebook profile, your, whatever it might be, or your website, or as you were talking about, the knowledge panel on Google. And the back of a book is a version of that. So the copy that talks about what the book's about and what you're about. So I think that's what she's referencing to. Now, your question on intuition. I find that the left brain, right brain distinction useful until it's not. And George Box, the statistician, famously said that all models are flawed and some are useful. And what we're seeing with corpus callosum and left and right hemisphere of the brain and cognitive science is we're seeing almost a collapsing of the distinction, which is not something that bothers me. Like I am very happy that in pretty much all learnings, the compassionate concession is to separate things into understandable chunks and then at some point integrate them on the journey to mastery. And so I think this whole idea of separation and integration is a natural flow with how we develop and embody knowledge. That being said, so when I talk about intuition, I can separate it into sense making and pattern recognition, which is a highly analytical process. You may not always be conscious of your knowings, and probably worth invoking John Vervaeke, the cognitive science professor at Toronto University, and some of his work on the 4 Ps, like the 4 ways we know: perspectival knowing, participatory knowing, other things like that. So it's something for your listeners to check in with. And then I was an atheist for 25 years, and now I don't identify as such. And the process of intuition can take, as I said, an ontological or a metaphysical bent. So whether it's pattern recognition, I don't care, or whether it's deeply connecting to universal consciousness, I don't care. But what I am aware through the Advaitic traditions of non-duality is there is this moment where we go from a transparent view of the world, where our consciousness thinks it is the world, through to an opaque view of the world, where we sort of step back and we realize we are not the objects of our life. We are the subject or witness of the objects. And then we take one more step back where you realize you're the ground of being that looks through all of those. So intuition, when described from the objective view or the subject, object, witness view, or the ground of being view, it's a different answer to that question. I think you just got that. I don't think any of my answers are short, but I will try and keep them brief.
I find that fascinating because I did not understand what intuition was until just recently, last year. No, not even this year. Last year, I was given the advice by a psychic medium who saved a family member's life, one of my family members' lives, during my podcast interview of him, which is quite an interesting story. I mean, what are the odds out of a 3-week stint of no podcast because I was getting ready to move to Florida that I would interview him and him alone, and that would be at the moment that a family member was having a stroke, and she wouldn't have gone to the hospital if it wasn't for him. So it's incredible. And he told me in a reading that I'd never done readings before. I was just not inclined to that. I used to be agnostic myself.
You're a biochemist by training, right? So
yes, that's true.
So it doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. So I ended up getting a reading from him, and this reading was really profound. And one of the things that he shared at the end was, by the way, listen to your intuition and follow it. This is very important. And I took that to heart, and I didn't know where that would lead me. But boy, after the events that have happened this year with me, which is for another story, for another podcast episode, it's been incredible. And I am tuned in to intuition constantly. And it's not me. I'm not coming up with this stuff. I'm just tuned in to, like you said, the universal consciousness, my angels, whatever you want to call it. It is profound.
What I love is two guys who are heavily grounded in the sciences having this conversation in the year 2021. For those that are on YouTube, if they check out Stefan's shirt, it kind of represents the integration of the synergy that you're kind of referencing, which is the interconnectedness of everything, and then also the geometry. And I think this is going to be useful when we get to talking about pink sheet structures. So we're on a content marketing podcast. People go, what are these dudes off and talking about? And essentially what we're exploring is, where does knowledge come from? And I think by the end of this podcast, we'll have had a conversation about where your thought leadership could originate from. And I think it might just be enough to sort of give people three, like a scaffold of three, and that we're talking about the third. So the first scaffold is that knowledge is exploratory, and these all start with E's conveniently. So, like an archaeologist with a little dusting broom, you're searching for insight by excavating knowledge. And I'd suggest that the scientific reductionist sort of mechanistic view that's been prevalent for the last 400 odd years is really good at that. And it's given us a lot of rigor and a lot of scientific method about the excavation of knowledge. And I love that. I think that knowledge is also experiential. So our lived experience gives us a sense of knowledge, but that's not one-dimensional. So, for example, it can be experienced based on what you've done. So like your resume. Knowledge can be unearthed by what you know. So it's what you've learned along the way, discrete subject matter expertise. But it's also the essence of who you are. And so you can experience it through sort of at least those three timelines. And whenever working with thought leaders, I go, okay, so what have you done? And we put a resume on a timeline with all these critical moments, and we go, what have you learnt? And then we do, well, now with what have you learnt, we document that. And then we do, well, who are you? And when you get essence, expertise, and experience, and you bring those three things together, that's that experiential knowledge source. And the third one that we're talking about is emergent. And emergent knowledge is less evidentiary, and it's more, I can never say this word right, but it's like a revelation. It's revelatory. And when you look at the need for evidence-informed decision-making, which a lot of thought leaders think they need, and a lot of content marketers build their world on. They go, so thought leadership for content marketers is survey your market and then publish a report. And for me, that's like, that's not thought leadership. That's not insight development. That's just simply gathering data and then feeding it back to people. And make no mistake, pattern recognition from the analysis and interpretive meaning of big data is great, but it's sort of primary or rudimentary at best. It's like what you do under the age of 7. And it doesn't link to wisdom. And so this third one, this one that we're talking at, that intuition taps into, this idea of emergent knowledge, raises all kinds of questions that are ontologically challenging. And they are those classic philosophical questions of who am I, where do I come from, do I even matter, and when I go, where do I go? And, philosophers of all kinds for centuries have had conversations on this. And I'm a bit indifferent to it. I'm really happy to sit with whoever wants to talk. So if someone wants to do Socratic method or Neo-Platonic concepts, I'm happy to listen. It's a bit like sport. I'm the best friend to watch sport with because I'm like a goldfish. I forget the rules of sport. And so every time I sit down, I'm your new friend that's got to learn how cricket is or how American football is or something like that. So I'm a really good audience member to watch the sport, but I really don't care. And I care in the moment deeply. And I care. Once someone said, are you interested in what I'm talking about? And I said, I'm really interested in anything you're really interested in. What I'm not interested in is the things that are just flippantly put up into conversation. So for me, intuition is really getting into the idea of emergent knowledge, and people get uncomfortable with it. But I think what I want to suggest is that almost every line of scientific inquiry began with some form of intuitive wonder, some open curiosity, whether it's, sitting in a bath and watching it leak over, or an apple falling on your tree from a tree, whichever perspective it comes from, or looking at the moon and the sun and determining whether we're heliocentric or not. Like, it's someone just goes, I wonder. And they open themselves up to curiosity and wonder. And I wonder, for me, I think that's enough for intuition, just to say, don't be too premeditated, don't be too preordained, and don't be too evidence-informed. Now, I don't mean that we're not evidence-informed. I just mean open yourself up to other possibilities that knowledge can emerge from more than just the prevailing sort of scientific method view. And we're both scientists, so we love hypothesis. We love experimentation. We both love the idea of being cautious with propositional knowing, where someone goes, this is true. We go, well, maybe it's not. And that healthy skeptic nature is powerful. But what I think a lot of people do is they then become cynics. And their skepticism goes from, I wonder if that's true, useful, or relevant. And they actually start going, I wonder how I can shoot that down. And I think that if we looked at First Nations people around the world, like I'm grounded here in Australia, so the Indigenous of Australia are the Eora Nation, and the Eora Nation had 500 nations in it. So if you look at a map of Australia and you look at it as the Eora Nation, you'll see 500 different nations. And I'm in the land of the Gadigal, which is Sydney Harbour. So all the water that sits around Sydney with the Opera House and the bridge and the things you see in your New Year's Eve montages around the world with fireworks. But that Indigenous knowledge is 70,000 years old. And the primitive assumption is that before colonisation, there was savagery and barbarity. And that just can't be true. It just can't be true that for 70,000 years, up until the last 250, that things were... And so there's actually deep knowledge on complex adaptive systems, on chaos theory, embedded in the stories and the Dreamtime stories of our Indigenous. So I think that there is a huge intuitive knowing. Tyson Yunkaporta, one of my, if you wanted to learn more about Australian Indigenous knowledge, he wrote a book called Sand Talk, and I'm just holding that up for those that are on the audio podcast. And he's the head of Indigenous knowledge at Deakin University, which is sort of in Melbourne, in Victoria, in Australia. And his mob is from Cape Fear, which is top right of Australia. And he talks about walking with his uncle in crocodile-infested waters, and that they walk knowing that the crocodile is just at the drop-off. So you're walking in water up to your knees, and the water then drops off, and the crocodiles sit in the drop-off. And that the Indigenous of Australia walk aware that the crocodile is there, but not putting any attention on it. Now, that's an extraordinary concept. And we diminish it as superstitious mumbo-jumbo or the primitive assumption. You go, hang on a sec. They have been able to walk in crocodile-infested waters hunting for 60 to 70,000 years. Maybe we should listen a little bit to this idea that there's a knowing beyond the logical obvious that is in your head. So this is going to be a 4-hour podcast if you and I start riffing on this.
Oh, this is so good. That reminds me of the Dogon tribe in Africa, knowing somehow that there were multiple stars in the Sirius star system, and that one circled the other, and its orbit was 50 years. Somehow they've known that for decades upon decades before there was even a way to measure it or know it. That's just it's phenomenal. It's incredible. And speaking of scientists, one of my favorite scientists is Carl Jung. And I don't know if you know the story of how synchronicity was coined as a term. It was by Carl Jung. Do you know that story?
I do. I love one of Peter Gabriel's songs, which is a tribute to Carl Jung, and it's called Mercy Street. And it takes a poem that talks about him watching the whirling dervishes. And Elizabeth Gilbert in her TED Talk sort of talks about that moment as well, her first TED Talk, about the moment where a dervish will dance in a frenzy and that people will go, Allah, Allah. And what they're saying is that moment there is God. And that the Spanish matadors picked up exactly the same word. So I love synchronicity. I think it's something we'll come back to around emergent knowledge and plagiarism. So at some point today, if we get to it, it's like a little mental note or a little pin. Let's come back to that. But talk more about synchronicity.
Yeah. So what happened in the moment that he discovered this thing he called synchronicity was he was doing a psychoanalysis session. The patient he was dealing with, she was doing her dream recall. She talks about the significance of this necklace. It was a gold scarab necklace. And while she's doing the dream recall of this, there's a tapping on the window, a very insistent and incessant tapping. They're 3 stories up. Like, who could that be? And also the room was dark. Who's trying to get into a darkened room from outside 3 stories up? But eventually it just didn't give up. So he would go to the window and opened it. And guess what was at the window to come in? A scarab beetle.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. So he grabs it and he presents it to the woman who didn't believe in anything, that she couldn't, her experience with her 5 senses. And that rocked her world. And of course it rocked the world of Carl Jung, because he was so gobsmacked by it. He decided to do a whole bunch of research on synchronicity, write an entire book called Synchronicity, and the rest is history.
Yeah, and then Sting made all that money out of one song. So, look, the thing I love, my favorite Carl Jung quote, while we're sort of on the story of Carl Jung, is he says that until we make our unconscious conscious, we will go through life repeating patterns and call it fate. And I love, to me, if there were a line and that underneath the line was like left brain analytical scientific rationalism, and above the line was spirituality. So science on the below the line and spirituality above. Carl Jung sits for me as someone who surfed the line. And almost like an ECG curve, he would go above and below the line. So if you took the mythopoetic nature of his archetype view, that feels very above the line. But if you see it mapping to, say, the Persian Enneagram, which the Sufi, around Rumi's time, the Enneagram, that everyone knows that, I'm sure. It's almost like your T-shirt looks like the Enneagram, where you could put the numbers of the Enneagram around it, like, are you an 8 with a wing 7, or are you a 6? And that's almost the basis of Synergistic International's LSI. It's almost the basis of Myers-Briggs, are you an ENFJ? And this overlay of this making of patterns is something that I think as content marketers, if you're trying to capture your thought leadership, almost being able to create patterns in conceptuals. So like, we'll talk about aggregation in a minute, which is that idea that you take an idea and you join it with another and you join it with another to create your insight. So it's like aggregative knowledge, where you aggregate the pre-existing knowledge. That's pattern recognition. So it's making the unconscious conscious, so that the repeating patterns are something that you can share as insights. And to some extent, the survey nature of content marketing as thought leadership talks to that. So it's very like left-brainy. But there's also just to stay open and to this whole idea of insight. And I think what I love about where this is going, which is wonderful, Stefan, and is this idea of the integration of, as opposed to the separation of, and the integration of science and spirituality, the integration of And spirituality is a weird word because people immediately make it religion, and they immediately make it identifying with like an other that's generally male, generally white, generally in a cloud called heaven. And that's not actually the conversation. So I just love this idea that we're opening this podcast on marketing for content marketers with this sort of conversation about the integration of left and right. So I think almost to close the loop on that, not to shut the conversation down, but just to give it a nice little ribbon around the parcel. We often think of the world as two columns, this versus that. And I think what we're talking about is it is useful as like a compassionate concession. Like if you're trying to help someone get across a new piece of information, you would go, it's this versus that, or it's this and that. And you would even draw two columns. Like you can imagine the way marketing used to be, the way the marketing needs to be today. Past, future. You could make that three columns, past, present, future. But what you're doing is you're basically creating a binary conversation and a this versus that or a this and that. And I think that's really, really useful. And in the commercial skeptical world, I think that's a critical thing to do. But at some point, you need to make the move to put an infinity sign over the columns and start to explore the integration and start to explore the things that don't fit so perfectly into the boxes. I loved in Good to Great, Jim Collins, I really just loved the chapter name, The Tyranny of the Or. So OR. So the tyranny of this or that. And I love that idea that none of us would like tyranny. And so binary, dualistic thinking, this versus that, this or that, is a useful first move in unpacking knowledge. And so I'd almost say to any content marketer, if you want to make an impact and draw attention, draw a column and put the old world on the left and the new world on the right and make sure you're delivering solutions into the new world. And everyone goes, yeah, okay, I can do that. And I go, perfect. You done that? And they go, yep. I say, create a third choice now. And they go, huh? I go, well, take your two columns and shove another one in between or on either end. I don't matter, but get to three columns. Because when you go from the didactic nature of two to the tridactic nature of three, and once you get in, which is why Venn diagrams are such a useful model for us to use, because three circles breaks the tyranny of the two. What you're doing is you're moving almost from, so you could imagine a content marketer going two columns in a white paper. And everyone goes, yep, two columns. And then they go, third choice. And people go, wow, third choice, hadn't thought of it that way. And then the thought leader, the marketer goes, infinity sign. And you can almost hear people go, that's so useful because you've stepped them through the two columns, the three columns, and then the infinity sign. And if you just go on that journey, just that, if that alone is how you think about sort of insight and concept, you'll find that your thought leadership is starting to look for synchronicities. If we circle back to Carl Jung, starting to look for integrations and trying to move beyond the purely observable as knowing and start to look at the emergent. Because the nature of going from two columns to three opens up new synapses in your brain, new relationships, new ways of knowing. And then when you turn it into infinity, you start to look at the consequential nature and the complex adaptive system nature of the ideas, and then it starts to become a living, breathing thing. And what you've got to do is not go into that knowing everything that's going to end up on the piece of paper. You need to go into that open and curious, intuitively connected, open and curious to what's going to emerge beyond just your conscious thinking. So subconscious, conscious, patterns, calling it fate, the Carl Jung quote, it all dovetails into this moment.
It's like a transcendent experience. And you bring everyone in the room or on the video or live stream or whatever along with you on that ride.
And one of the things I love is the distinction between immanent and transcendent. So I love the use of the word transcendent, except for the fact that it locates. So because if I identified with anything, it would be the Advaitic tradition, which is the non-dualistic view. And the problem with transcendent is it's right, but it takes away agency because it suggests that you are transcending to a place, and this is not the only definition of transcendent, obviously, but one of the things when people say the word transcendent, they're saying there is something not me out there doing something I know what, which is almost like a physicist view. I think it was Feynman who said that. There is something in the universe doing something we we don't know what. That's not the correct quote. And what I like is immanent, is I also like to go, look, like don't locate it somewhere else and give up your agency. Just allow for the sake that beyond just your pure waking consciousness, there's even your dream consciousness, there's your archetypical consciousness, and then maybe the collective consciousness. And you don't need to have beliefs around this. You just go, that is your experience, that things happen synchronically that have nothing to do with the moment you're in or the logic that you're in. And we know this. And there's deep science to explain the intuition of walking down a street and sensing danger. You could have sensed danger because of body language. You could have sensed danger because of almost like genetic narratives, like we've been told, watch out for men lurking in corners, in shadows. You could sense danger because your pheromones, your olfactory senses are picking up chemical pheromones that are off track from someone else. So there's all sorts of ways to explore where this knowing comes from, but I don't get too caught up in needing to know where it comes from. I just get caught up in, it's like they're butterflies. Insights are butterflies flying around, and that your job is to kind of just scoop them up and then order them in some way so that they're useful to your market.
So true. And a related concept that I think opens people up to this kind of exploration is the willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, totally right.
And what you were saying earlier about the close relationship between cynicism and skepticism, I see them as two sides of the same coin. So if you're playing with skepticism, you are just a hair's breadth away from cynicism.
Yeah, and look, I totally get that, because I think a lot of cynics are masquerading under the banner of skeptic. So the hair's breadth away comment, I totally get that. I don't mind a skeptic, though, because a true skeptic has their arms crossed, literally or figuratively, and they say, I do not love or hate this yet. Make your case. And what I like about that is I'm big on agency and sovereignty. If I was to look at the political landscape of left and right or progressive and conservative, I choose neither. I choose the classical libertarianism and the concept of emancipation as, like if I'm talking to you, as someone in this extraordinary democracy, like of the United States, and I go, I actually think emancipation was deep at the heart of the Constitution. And, I think there's all sorts of reasons why the Constitution might be fatally flawed. And as an Australian, I'm like a guest in a house. I don't want to point out what's wrong with the colour on the wall, because I choose neither. So I'm not going to choose progressive or conservative. I'm an agent in a reader. And basically, I believe in increasing sovereignty for everybody, but never at the expense of me. I want everybody to have a more sovereign life. And I think that's at the heart of the promise of the great democracy that United States stands as. And I can't remember what that's got to do with where we were coming from, but I know in the conversation today that it's that idea of being able to locate yourself. It's around cynics and skeptics, because I could almost go, there's a cynical view of the liberal, of the extreme left, and there's a skeptical view of like the Republican of the extreme right. And you kind of can sit there and go, there's something else, which is how to access both of them and to not have to take on a party's policy. And I know politics is not what this is about, but even just this model that I'm sort of drawing for those that are not on YouTube and are listening to this, it's like a pendulum, I guess, is what I'm suggesting, where there's like a scythe swinging from left to right, and that the pivot point on top might be this concept of emancipation or classical libertarianism. And I think that the ability to have a progressive view on healthcare and a conservative view on education should be something you could hold, and that you wouldn't have to, as an individual, take on a whole packet of knowledge. So if you said to me, why do you do what you do now, Matt? I go, I want to liberate independent thinkers, because I think that when we adopt the opinions of a group and we kind of abdicate and delegate our sense-making to a group but don't understand the agenda, the players, the a priori concepts that lead to it, I think what we do is we give up our agency and sovereignty. And I think the world is better when everybody stands in their sovereignty and that we respect each other's. And that's this thing of classical libertarianism I absolutely love, which is I should be free to do whatever I want as long as it doesn't impinge on you doing whatever you want. And the minute it does, it becomes fascism and totalitarianism. So I don't know how we got there, but I think cynic and skeptic is linked to that just a little bit. So I hear you with the hair's breadth away, and I think it's like a fine red wine, a nice Barolo or a Merlot. It's got complexity to it, and you don't just gulp it down like a tequila shot. I mean, there's good tequila. Don't get me wrong.
Awesome. Now, there's something that we will get talking through the frameworks of Pink Sheets, but there's one other thing that just popped in my mind. Maybe it was intuition that I feel like we need to at least address. It's something that I don't really understand, and it comes from the indigenous of Australia, and that is the term walkabout.
Yeah. Well, it has a number of meanings depending on which lens you look at it through. Now, I'm a white Australian and I have Celtic roots, which means at some point I came here into a colonised system and got to experience privilege. So anything I comment on around Indigenous is not even second-hand or third-hand. It's like 28th hand away. So I'll invoke Tyson again, Juncker Porter. He's on a number of podcasts in the sense-making community, so people can start riffing out on him. So I'm just going to explain what he says about that as opposed to interpreting it myself. If you look at Indigenous cave art, which is like 70,000, it's old thought leadership, content marketing. Where are the wallabies and the kangaroos? How do we hunt whale and when do we hunt them? Depending on which nation you're in of the Eora nation, their knowledge was kept. In fact, we've got mining companies at the moment blowing up 60 and 70,000 year sacred sites. So this is something horrendous that's happening in my country. He says, so I think anybody would have seen hand art. It's like a hand painted on a cave. And what Tyson says is instead of looking at the hand art through the Western lens and go, oh, that's an interesting primitive hand painting, he said, why don't you take the Indigenous hand and put it as a lens through which you see the world? And so it's like rose-coloured glasses. Put Indigenous coloured glasses. And because he's a professor of Indigenous knowledge, but he's also a professor of systems thinking. So he understands complex adaptive networks. He understands, how to be a node in a living network. And he would suggest to you that the Australian Indigenous nations have an adaptive quality, that they were a complex adaptive network in a very harsh land. Most of Australia is very harsh and unforgiving. And yet the Indigenous lived, with very, very dangerous flora and fauna, from snakes to crocodiles to spiders that'll kill you. Like it's a thing, and I know that becomes one of those sensationalist views. So a little bit like Tyson's story of walking with his uncle and sensing the crocodile but not paying it any attention. The Indigenous in Australia will go walkabout. So if you were employing them in your company, they disappear for 3 months. And you go, I'm paying you, you can't just go walkabout. And they go, no, I have to go walk. I have to walk the land. And that they walk the land deeply connected to the land. And there's all kinds of things they read. So, for example, the absence of big fauna, so large animals. The absence of large animals means that a piece of land is about to go through a renewal cycle. And in Australia, the renewal cycle is typically bushfire, like California style, reduce everything to ash fire. And they walk the land to get a sense of what's the next move in the complex adaptive network. So they're looking for, and that this is a lost knowledge, but that a lot of the knowledge that has been passed down is embedded in country. So the Indigenous Australian will talk about acknowledging country and being deeply embedded in country, and not as a form of biomimicry, which is what can we learn from nature and adopt it. Like snowflakes are fractal, your organisation should be adaptive. You go, yeah. The elders of the traditions in Australia don't believe in biomimicry. What they believe is you're deeply embedded in your land. And so the walkabout is, from a Western lens, it's someone you employ skiving off and not working for 3 months. Through the Indigenous lens, it's a deep connection to land and country for an understanding of what's going to happen in the system next and what's your role in it. And is it time to move your family on because there's not going to be food here? Is the fire coming? And how do you survive volatile, uncertain, complex, and adaptive worlds? So, once again, depending on how you look at it, right? So walkabout is used as a negative label through the Western lens sometimes. And when you hear it through the Indigenous lens, you go, okay, that's a completely different story. It's just housing and clothing and supermarkets and abattoirs and big agriculture. Just don't see it that way. And in a post-industrial revolution, you would think that the factory workers should stand at the factory, but that makes absolutely no sense to our Indigenous. Just like ownership makes absolutely no sense. So they don't understand shareholding. They understand custodial contribution. They don't understand shareholding extraction. And when you think of just a mine and a sacred site, you go, yeah, crazy. So once again, I'm a white Australian of Celtic origin who's turned up here in a 250-year history and is then sitting over the top of a 70,000-year tradition. So I just leave it to Tyson and others, but this may end up being 2 podcasts.
Yeah, could be. Okay, so what just came to my mind while you were describing walkabout is how there were 3 types of, I get this duality of the hunters and the gatherers, but there was another, it was, what's the word again? Tridactic, I guess.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there was the spotter as well. And the spotter is now labeled as deficient, as ADD. But in actuality, it's a superpower.
Yeah, I love that.
A person who's listening, who thinks of themselves as ADD or highly distractible or kind of hyperactive or whatever, I would invite you to reevaluate that as a superpower, because if you were living back in the times of the hunters and gatherers, you were the spotter, or one of the spotters that kept the tribe alive. If there was another tribe that was going to hunt you down and murder you and your family because they were sneaking up on you, you'd be the first to spot this. If the herd is on the move and that's your food source and they're leaving for another part of the land and you're not aware of that, everybody dies. So the spotter is the lifesaver of the group in that moment. So that is a superpower. And now we're treating these people with Ritalin, like, what? So that's what came to me when you were talking about walkabout and being so connected to the land that you're part of the organism.
Yeah, totally. And that's exactly what it's about. It's like the not to be biomimicry, having just sort of positioned that as wrong, but it's like a spider on a web and you feel the movement off to the left. You go, oh, there's something there. And that kind of hyper alert. And I agree with you. I think that one of the greatest, I don't want to over-sensationalize it, but poetically I would want to say one of the greatest crimes we perpetuate on others is by making them wrong, not strong. And what you've just invoked with the branding of a superpower, I think is true if we were talking to individuals. So forget about your role as a content marketer, and we were just talking about what could your unique contribution be. It could possibly be found in the things that society might make wrong. And what I like to do is under the banner of strong, not wrong, is to do a little exercise that people can do by themselves. It's very simple. I go, what are 3 behavior traits that you've been made wrong for in the past? And you might go, I've been called a bully. And I go, okay, well, bully's not great. It's got a persecutor kind of vibe to it. What do people say you should be instead of a bully? And they go, well, you should be kind, perhaps. And so you create the juxtaposition of the opposite. And I go, okay, so to make you wrong, if I elevate kindness and say you've got to be kinder in your conversation, I'm basically making your bulliness wrong. And the third move is to not play the contrast of opposites, but to spin the negative into a positive, which is what you've just done. You've gone, ADD is identified as easily distracted. And you've gone, and so the opposite should be deeply focused. And you go, sure, I'm not going to make deeply focused wrong, but I don't want to make easily distracted wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say someone who's easily distracted is a convergent thinker, a divergent thinker. So they're expanding their views and highly aware and attuned. And so I go, who thinks awareness might be good? And I go, yeah, I think awareness might be great. So who reckons there's a time to look down and a time to look out? And people go, yeah. And what you just said in the deep tribal knowledge of true collaborative, diverse cultures, I think this idea of strengths diversity is super interesting to me, not to diminish ethnic diversity, not to diminish demographic diversity, not to diminish gender diversity, but just to say, and also let's look at strengths diversity, which is what you're kind of signaling to. And I love that as a practice. And by the way, it's deeply useful for those, if I said, write a book, if I said to every content marketer here, use your content marketing to grow the business you work for, no problem. But I'd like you to write a book. And what will happen is everybody will go, all right, let's pretend I was your mentor and let's pretend you'd come to me and you'd said, what should I do? I say, write a book. There'll be this moment where you go, well, I've got nothing to say that hasn't already been said. And you walk into a bookstore. So I write on leadership. And you walk into the leadership section in bookstores, if you could ever find one today. And there's so many books and so many of them are fabulous that you generally stop, go into despair and go, there's nothing for me to add. And I want to go, no, there really is. And if you could take the lens of the thing you've been made wrong for and you turned it into a strength, and then you wrote a leadership book from, say, 3 wrongs that you've made strong, and now your contribution to the leadership landscape is to talk about leadership through those 3 superpowers. Oh my gosh. So let's pick your ADHD person. If they said leadership awareness, the job of a leader is to be aware and attuned to the things outside the organization. So you have it as leader as scout. I love that. So imagine if you wrote a book called Leadership Scouting. I'd now go, okay, well, that's a new book. No one's written that. And that's this idea of when we were talking about, what you've done, what your experience and your expertise. I go, yeah, but your essence, who you are, is right embedded in this superpower. And I almost want to encourage thought leaders to apply this lens to their exploratory knowledge findings. So as you start to look at all kinds of things, like you read a book by anybody, you watch a Brené Brown talk talking about courage. Well, what do you want to talk about it? And, if, let's say, Stefan, you were pretending to hold this space of the scout, I would go, well, you need to look for courageous moments. So leaders need to be aware of the moments where they need to act with courage and where the individuals within their organization. So how do you treat someone as they step into a courageous moment? You don't criticize them. You don't give them feedback. Like when someone's stepping into a courageous moment, if you're a scout as a leader and aware, you sit underneath them and you scaffold them in that courageous moment. You enfold them and enwrap them. You don't judge them, criticize and performance review them. Now, that's a chapter. Like there's 2 or 3 chapters in a book on leader as scout that were deeply inspiring. Now, I can't write that book. I can see that book. I have a form of ADHD, which is the executive functioning, the anterior signet. So the anterior signet is a part of the brain in your executive functioning of the prefrontal cortex that if you're in a meeting and someone says something rude, if you don't have a good functioning anterior signet, you'll tell them. So it's the doesn't suffer fools in meetings. I have that. It's called executive function disorder. And I don't care about the label, to be honest. And I've learnt it at 52 years of age. So I'm pretty good that I've done 5 decades of whatever I define my life and success as, knowing that. And I'm glad no one told me. But it's good to realise that I have that moment where in a meeting, I've got to really sit on my hands because other people who have a normal functioning anterior signet will be diplomatic. And they won't be offended by the person. But I become deeply offended by the ignorant remark expressed in a group. And it's like this, well, you need to know that about yourself. So that's the wrong. The strong of that is everything I do in the world is on the other side of accepting and acknowledging that and living into it as a strength, not a weakness. So I'm the perfect person to call BS on someone's, remarks. I can sit there and go, yeah, no. I don't tolerate that tyranny. You don't get to, you don't get to tell me to sit down. You don't get to say that professor of that university is using micro gestures to hold you back. I go, no. You just stop right there, because I see fascists from 100 yards. And so you can see that so much of who we are is embodied sometimes on the edges of our capabilities, not in the normal bandwidth.
Wow. And do you see that? What is it called? Executive
function disorder.
Function disorder. Do you see this as a superpower or as a gift?
Oh, hell yeah. Absolutely. The philosophy at the heart of thought leaders, we teach individuals how to earn $0.5 to $1.5 million a year selling their time in a practice model. So we say you can get a job or you can start a business, and we say there's a third choice. So can you see my column game here? And the third choice is to go run a practice. And think of yourself like a brain surgeon, where you're delivering concepts and ideas or thoughts. We say, no, do trade time for money. Do put your name on the door and do become Stefan Spencer. And, you can see thought leadership in those who speak for a living, who train, who coach, who mentor, who author, and that's our world. But a big part of it, and you've also heard it in my philosophy of like classical libertarianism, is I'm going, so don't tell me what to do. Because I won't be part, I have a bit of oppositional defiance disorder as well. So if you take EFD and oppositional defiance and you put the two together, you go, you do not give me doctrine. You do not put me institutionally in an organization. I am a living node in a network, and I respect my role in it and making sure that how I behave doesn't decrease sovereignty for others. But you don't get to control me. I'm not your human resource that you get to employ. You don't get to take me one level above slavery as indented servitude. I will not ever wear ties because of the symbolism of what they mean, which is basically you put it on as almost a brand, like a slavery brand so you go, where does that all come from? Well, it's oppositional defiance and executive function disorder. But what it's about is that's deeply liberating, because I get to talk to individuals and I go, no, be the ghost in the machine. Be the indigenous knowledge that's respectful around your role in the complex adaptive network, but also maintains agency as opposed to superiority. I think a lot of our environmental crisis is around an inability to get deeply integrated in the systems we're in. And it's like if your food comes wrapped in cellophane or cling wrap and on a plate, and you don't have any association to that where that came from, then your consumption becomes, not to use fancy words, but it's unenlightened. It's not mindful. And it's just a real simple thing. Next time you eat something, just think about how it got to your plate. Just do that for a minute. And you suddenly start to see supply chain. And we've seen this with the pandemic, haven't we, where we've seen disruptions in supply chain because we've sort of globalized everything. And I'm not against all those things. I love progress. I just think that my superpowers give me the ability to be a herald or a bard, in the old sort of medieval language, to sit on the outside and question and to offer contributions in service to others. And I think this is going on, and I apologize, Stefan, but essentially our job is to be self-expressed in service to others and rewarded for the contribution. And if you put those three things together, I think what you're doing is stepping out of any of the containments of conversation. So, a progressive might go, our job is to be in service to others. A conservative might go, I want to be rewarded for my contribution. And the classical libertarian might go, I want to be fully self-expressed. And when you bring the three together, I think you've got a beautiful harmonic system. It's when we tend to drop into any one of them that I think we get lost. So
I'm just floored with the way that your mind works. It's really impressive. And you have a way with coming up with models and frameworks on the fly. I was so amazed with how you came up with book titles and ideas for chapters and everything just completely on the fly. And this then ties into the concept that I wanted to make sure we covered, which is pink sheets, getting things out of your head into a framework or a model or metaphor that then makes sense for someone, whether they're in the audience in your keynote presentation, or they're watching you on video, or they're looking at their Facebook feed and they see a post by you, just a a simple text or image post. So I would love to go into some detail on that.
All right. Well, let's riff on this for a little bit. I'm going to say a whole bunch of things, but before I do, let me suggest there's a book that all my books are digitally free. So for any of your listeners who want to go to my website, mattchurch.com, they click on the book tab and all my books can be downloaded. And there's a whole episode in why I do that, which is I believe I'm in the experience business, not the ideas business. And I think in a world where ideas are ubiquitous and free, we've moved from the scarcity model where publishing a book was hard to an abundance model where everyone's got an opinion on everything. And I think that someone's attention is the currency, not my ideas. So as a thought leader, I make a living by creating experiences. So I'll create an experience for an organization and it'll be a one-day event. I'll take 50 people on a 3-day retreat. I'll sit with an individual for 2 or 3 hours. These are all experiential things. So I charge for experiences. But what I deliver in those experiences, concepts. And there's sort of 2 things we need to sort of cover off in this sort of 20 minutes or so that we've got left. One of them is the architecture of an idea. And then the second is how to deliver that idea into the world. And each one of them, is an episode in its own. So the pink book called Think is the book that people would want to download, which unpacks the pink sheet process. I have a website called pinksheetprocess.com where I've open sourced, you could call it a technology. So the tool called a pink sheet is a technology that enables you to capture your thinking. And the reason why this is important is we haven't really been taught to think. If I said to someone, go think, what would you do? Would you create a mind map? Would you create a bullet list? These are all sort of pathways into thinking, but it doesn't feel robust enough. So what the pink sheet is essentially on a piece of paper, 5 locations. But before I get to those 5 locations, if people could imagine, for those that are listening on the podcast, put a compass with a north, a south, an east, and a west on a piece of paper that you've organised portrait style. The verticality, like the backbone of an idea, is that they are at the bottom, at the south, incredibly concrete. And at the north, they can be incredibly abstract. So if I said, what is a croissant? You would go, it's a pastry. I go, what is pastry? You would go, it's food. I go, what is food? You'd go, it's energy. I go, what is energy? You'd go, it's life. I go, what is life? You might go, God. All right. So you've gone from croissant all the way to God, and that's the verticality of an idea, but we're talking about the same thing. You could do it with a nashi pear, which is a fruit. What's a fruit? It's a food. And that we can interpret this vertebra, the vertical, y-axis, the north-south dimension of an idea as concrete to abstract. And as thinkers, we have a tendency towards either. So we're either meta and theoretical, or we're matter and practical. And I want to say that a full spectrum concept, when you think, capture your idea across that spectrum. So the verticality from concrete to abstract. We've already in this podcast sort of seeded a couple of these ideas by example. And if you go back and listen to this podcast again, on the other side of this final 15 minutes, you'll actually be able to see the frameworks that I'm talking about being utilized. So the horizontal, the east-west axis of your compass is this idea of to the left, let's put left brain things, so analytical things, and to the right, let's put right brain things. So if you could see this compass now and push it into the background, so watermark it on your paper, it's no longer the piece of paper, but it's a watermark that's embedded into the paper. So in grayscale, it's light and it's floated underneath it. What we're now going to do is layer on top of that vertically, we're going to divide this piece of paper that you're holding portrait into thirds, a bottom third, a middle third, and a top third. So 2 lines sort of divided into bottom, middle, and top. Let's call the bottom third content. Let's call the top third context. Now, context is a word that can be used as in the situation you're in, my working context, my home context, but I want to use it around abstraction, so the north part of the vertebra. So we're going to say, but when I say context, I mean abstract. I don't mean situation you find yourself in. And the middle third, let's just call that concept. And if people want to sort of access like the epistemology of this idea, if you just understand strategy versus tactics, you go, I get it. If you understand big picture versus detail, you go, I get it. So it's not, I don't claim that this is original in any way. It's just a synthesized sort of process, which is why the tool is open source and free to the world. You could call the top third the meta. So when we talk about metacognition, that could be a way people access this. You could call the bottom third the matter. And what I encourage people to do now is sort of in their mind's eye or on the piece of paper, if they're doing, is to put a figure 8 around from top to bottom. So it's like the infinity sign, but sitting up as an 8. And I would say, do you get that the context has a big bulgy part at the top, the meta? And I say, meta doesn't take a lot of time, but it takes up a lot of space. Don't think of a pink elephant is a meta phrase, and you can't not. So meta fills minds. It takes up space. And the matter, the bottom third, imagine the figure 8 coming down to the bottom third, that takes up a lot of time. So to tell stories and to give people case studies and examples and facts and to interpret data and all the content that is the croissant, the nashi pear, all the stuff that is concrete and real takes up a lot of time. So what a lot of thought leaders do is they live in the stuff, so they live in the matter, or they live in the context, the big picture, the meta. And to be a well-rounded thought leader, you need to access all three domains, the matter, the meaning, and the meta. So the pink sheet is a tool that now, if you understand, you take the figure 8 and you ghost it now back. So you've got the north, south, east, west. You've got the figure 8 and you've got the third, the third, the third. All of them are ghosting now as watermarks. We have 5 tools, specific tools, thinking tools. And when you capture your ideas, we suggest you are full spectrum and that you use all 5. And they're very, very simple. You should, top left, use models. Put geometric shapes together, squares, triangles, and circles, and combine them in some way to frame the context. Use metaphors, which are the right brain big picture, the right brain meta tool. And that when you integrate, so first of all, separate them as models and metaphors, and then eventually integrate them. So your models have metaphors as embedded or intrinsic in them. And down the bottom third, you want to get numbers and narrative. So what you want to do is have stories and case studies, statistics, and personal journey stuff. So when you add the narrative quality and the number quality, you separate them out first by going, here's a case study, here's some statistics, here's some research. That would be bottom left of the pink sheet. But you also might have a personal story, as you did, about the interview when one of your family members in Florida was dealing with a potential stroke, if I recall correctly. So understanding that some people are listening to this on an auditory podcast, you may want to download the pink sheet example. You may want to watch the videos that we've put on the pink sheet process and download the book to help you with this. But it's basically that you can take these frameworks and sort of double click on models and metaphors, numbers and narratives. And the middle one is mantras. So concepts are points you make, they're statements you make, they're propositions you put forward. So that's the structure of a pink sheet. Now, what often needs to happen is the theory of that's great, and I'm teaching how to do it. But one of the things that's worth accessing is probably why, is if you think only in application, so you write a white paper, the insights are buried in application. If you only create a speech, the insights are baked into the speech, and I can't leverage them in any way. So insight mobility is about capturing what you know on a pink sheet so that we can then deliver it in lots of different ways. So you can deliver it in a book, in a little video, you can deliver it in a social media post. You just got to know which bit of the pink sheet to use when. But the trick is think delivery agnostic. So form your thinking without any sort of attachment to how you're going to share it. And if you use the pink sheet process, you'll then have all of the elements captured so that you can share them in all the different ways we do, which might be another podcast for another time. But when we tell someone something, we use a different part of the pink sheet. When we show somebody something, we use a different part of the pink sheet. And when we ask somebody something, so we're sort of coaching them to knowledge, we use a different part of the pink sheet. But whether it's telling, showing, or asking, you'll just access different parts of the pink sheet. And it becomes almost a formula that you can use to go, I'm running a 3-day retreat using 3 pink sheets. How do I do that? And you go, well, you use this bit in the first hour, this bit in the second hour, this bit in the third hour, and that's how you plan a full day experience. As opposed to just writing a whole heap of stuff, putting it on a slide deck and blasting it out to an audience, which is deeply disrespectful. And also, you haven't done enough thinking. So you're speaking before you think. And the process is think before you speak. And that the pink sheet process is how we do that. Very conscious of your time, Stefan, and I went really, really fast. But those resources are there.
Well, this is phenomenal. And I want to just give a quick example of, in my life, in my business, how I have applied your principles so that our listener can understand how universally applicable and how, just in a practical sense, just a daily useful tool this pink sheet process is. So one of my webinar presentations has a slide on it. I just happened to notice it as going through it on a previous call today with a friend and client. And the slide content was just a few words: unconscious motivators and triggers. That's it. So that gave me a concept to talk to, but then I used a metaphor to really spice up the visual for that slide. And the visual was an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water are the conscious motivators, and of course, the unconscious motivators are what's under the surface that make up most of what we do. And that allows people to, like, we're not connecting the dots so much so that they can't imagine, or they're not thinking, they're just seeing a pretty picture. Like, if I were to have a concept of time is an illusion that I want to explain, and I had an optical illusion as the backdrop of that slide, that is too literal and boring, and there's no room for people to try and connect the dots on their own. And I just love coming up with these metaphors and then finding the images, although I do hand off to my team the task of going onto stock photo sites to find them and stuff. But I do really find these metaphors to be very powerful, and people enjoy the presentation so much more than the versions I used to do prior to understanding what pink sheets were. And the metaphors, I'd have bunches of words, lots of bullets, boring backgrounds, no backgrounds. It was death by PowerPoint.
Yeah. And that's such a great lived example, Stefan. So thank you for sharing it. For those that are just hanging on by the fingertips of their attention because there's a million things going on for them, every one of those dimensions of the pink sheet are explained with a chapter each in the book. So the chapter on metaphors talks about how deeply powerful they are. The chapter on models gives you some sort of drop-down template examples of squares, triangles, and circles shoved together. So I just don't want people to think we've given them a loose scaffold and nothing else. I think the process of using the pink sheet process to capture what you know profoundly changes your relationship with who you are and what you think you know. And so be courageous as you go through this process, because you're on the wrong side of a whole lot of good work. As you start to document this knowledge warehouse, this filing cabinet full of pink sheets, you start to realize that there are filing cabinets, there are drawers, there are folders that pink sheets nest and stack, and there's so much in this. But when you catalog your intellectual property, because a pink sheet is just an IP snapshot, it's just a thumbnail of an idea or an insight. When you begin to catalog them, you start to build a system of knowledge. And that system of knowledge is something that is highly valued. If we're in the wisdom economy right now, it's not that we don't have ideas, it's that we can't make them engaging, relevant, and meaningful. And by thinking full spectrum, what you do is you break your personal bias and you begin to become more considerate and compassionate to the diversity of audience. And not only that, but our own diversity. There are topics that I want to be deeply concrete on, and there are topics I want to be beautifully abstract on. And the ability to move, that's what the north, south, east, and west does. It gives you a compass that gives you the ability to navigate any idea or concept at whatever level of detail or in whatever direction you want to go in. And I think that goes back to sovereignty and agency. Stefan, it's beautiful to meet you. You're so wonderful to be in podcast with, because I feel like you create a space and that we get to have a conversation in that space. I feel like I filled a lot of that space today, so thank you for being so gracious.
Well, thank you. I mean, this was so much fun, and you are a powerhouse, and you definitely are channeling something too. It's like you got a lot of wisdom that you shared with our listeners today, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Pleasure.
And thank you, listeners. So please at least try your hand at doing a pink sheet or two and see where it takes you. The show notes will have all of the links that were talked about in this episode and all the different resources, Matt's books and templates and so forth. And we'll catch you on the next episode. This is your host, Stefan Spencer, signing off. I now invite you to check out the show notes, transcript, action-based checklist, and all the URLs mentioned in this interview of Matt Church at marketingspeak.com/297.
Thanks for listening to the Marketing Speak podcast. Your host has been Stefan Spencer, 3-time author and leading expert on SEO and online marketing, whose client list boasts such brands as Zappos, Sony, and Chanel. Want to learn more about SEO, social media, or just generally how to build an online empire? Visit marketingspeak.com for an archive of past episodes, along with transcripts and show notes. In addition, a wealth of resources that include video-based training, screencasts, webinars, white papers, articles, and blog posts can be found on his SEO coaching site, scienceofseo.com. To reach Stefan, visit his personal website at stefanspencer.com or email him directly at stefan@stefanspencer.com. Until next time.